History remembers the Macedonian Empire for its conquests, but beneath its triumphs lay a world that few dare to recall, a realm where desire became dominion, and human bodies served as the currency of power. In the palaces of Pella, generals who once marched beside Alexander turned their victories into pleasure, building hidden houses where the conquered were displayed as proof of divine right. Tonight we step behind those veiled doors into the empire's secret heart, to uncover how lust, ambition, and fear wove together to corrupt the legacy of one of history's greatest conquerors. This is not legend. This is the decay of a dream. When Alexander the Great died in Babylon, his empire fractured like shattered glass. In the lands he left behind, his generals carved kingdoms from the ruins, each proclaiming himself the heir of divine conquest. Yet in Macedonia, the birthplace of empire, something darker began to grow. Power had lost its purpose. Victory had no enemy left to devour. What remained was indulgence. Pella, once vibrant with soldiers and scholars, turned inward. Marble courtyards that once echoed with war councils now hosted feasts where drunken nobles toasted to their fading glory. The air smelled of incense, honeyed wine, and something unspoken, the slow rot of excess. In the streets below, the poor whispered that the gods had abandoned the sons of Alexander, for their eyes were fixed not on the stars, but on the flesh of the living. Among the spoils of Eastern conquest came prisoners, artisans, dancers, and attendants brought from Persia and Egypt as tributes. They were renamed, perfumed, and trained to please the new lords of Macedonia. What began as entertainment soon evolved into an institution. Beneath the marble villas, chambers were built, perfumed, candlelit, and guarded. The elite called them symposia of refinement. The slaves called them the quiet rooms. Thais was among the first. Once a courtesan in Persepolis, she had served kings with music and grace. In Pella, she was stripped of her silks and her name. She became a symbol of conquest, displayed at banquets to remind the generals of what they had won. Her eyes never lowered, even as men debated her price. It was said that Cassander himself once remarked that she carried Persia in her gaze. He meant it as praise, but to Thais it was a curse, proof that her identity had been reduced to an empire's memory. The historian Diodorus would later write that Macedon learned to feast upon its captives. The phrase was no metaphor. Power in Pella was measured by ownership of land, of gold, of beauty. To possess what another desired was to rule him. The generals, weary of endless rivalries, began to express victory not through battle, but through indulgence. Each sought to outdo the others in spectacle. They imported dancers from the Indus, philosophers from Athens, and the most skilled courtesans from across the Aegean. Within a few years, pleasure had become the empire's new form of politics. Whispers spread of secret gatherings where generals reenacted divine banquets, pretending to be Zeus, Dionysius, and Aphrodite, while their servants played the parts of mortal offerings. The rituals were said to bring luck in war, but no wars remained. The rites continued nonetheless, feeding a hunger that conquest could not satisfy. Beneath the glow of oil lamps, Thais watched as power lost its language. The men who once commanded legions now sought meaning in control over the powerless. She realized that what they desired was not her body, but her silence, the proof that their rule was absolute. And so she learned to endure without breaking, becoming a mirror to their corruption. By the year's end, the nobles of Pella had built their first true palace of pleasure, hidden behind the colonnades of a disused temple. It was called the House of Dionysius. The seed had been planted. What grew from it would devour the empire from within. After Alexander's generals divided his empire, the struggle for power no longer belonged to the battlefield, but to the banquet hall. Cassander in Macedonia, Lysimachus in Thrace, and Antigonus in Asia each sought to prove himself the true heir to the conqueror's spirit. But where armies had once marched, processions of captives now replaced them. Victory became a performance, and humiliation its applause. In Pella, Cassander transformed his villa into a palace of competition. Marble courtyards filled with musicians, torches, and foreign perfumes. Behind silken screens, the spoils of empire waited to be displayed. Persian, Syrian, and Ionian captives were dressed in jeweled veils and renamed after goddesses. Each name was a theft of divinity, a statement that Macedonian men ruled not only nations, but desire itself. The gatherings grew infamous as the Symposia of Kings, where drunken generals wagered not on war, but on who could command the obedience of beauty. Lysimachus sent exotic tributes from the east, a priestess from Babylon, a singer from Ecbatana, while Ptolemy of Egypt dispatched dancers trained in temple rituals. Cassander, unwilling to be outdone, ordered the construction of a new pleasure house within the temple precinct of Dionysus. There, beneath frescoes of divine revelry, human devotion was twisted into spectacle. This was the moment the house of Dionysus was born. The building itself seemed a paradox. Its facade bore verses praising moderation, yet its halls dripped with the scent of myrrh and sweat. Musicians played flutes through the night, their melodies drowning out whatever truths echoed behind closed doors. Inside, the conquered were made to reenact scenes from the gods' feasts, not as participants, but as instruments. When the generals toasted to Dionysus, slaves poured wine from golden amphorae, their hands trembling beneath jeweled cuffs. The air shimmered with heat, laughter, and the weight of unspoken despair. Cassander's courtiers praised the house as a symbol of civilization's refinement. Philosophers invited to the gatherings spoke of beauty as a form of control, comparing the taming of foreign lands to the mastering of passion. They wrote that pleasure, properly ordered, was proof of divine favor. Yet beneath the rhetoric lay something hollow. The empire that had once united East and West now consumed both, devouring the very cultures it claimed to celebrate. Among the captives was a young priestess from Ephesus who had served in the shrine of Artemis. She was renamed Selene after the moon and placed on display during the first feast held in the new hall. When Cassander demanded she sing, her voice did not tremble. She sang a hymn to her lost goddess, each note a quiet rebellion. For a moment, the hall grew still. Cassander smiled, pretending admiration, and ordered that she remain forever in the moon's service. From that night onward she vanished from the banquets, her name whispered only by servants. The message was clear. Defiance was beauty's final act. By the second year of Cassander's rule, the house of Dionysus had become the court's hidden capital. Lysimachus and his envoys visited to pledge alliances, their treaties sealed not with signatures, but with shared indulgence. The rulers who once fought for Alexander's throne now competed for control of the unseen realm, the commerce of bodies, and the illusion of divine pleasure. In the glow of torches, Macedonia celebrated itself as immortal, even as its soul began to decay. And beneath those painted ceilings, one silent figure observed the revelry, a former queen soon to be named Eurydice. She did not yet know that her own fall would turn the empire's pleasure into prophecy. Eurydice had once been the daughter of a noble Macedonian line, educated, poised, and destined for the throne. She was married young to Philip III Aridaeus, Alexander's half-brother, a man whose mind never fully matured, but whose name carried royal blood. Their marriage, arranged by those hungriest for power, was not a union of hearts but of opportunity. Eurydice became a queen without love and soon without freedom. When Alexander died in Babylon, the empire fractured like glass. The generals returned home bearing treasure, soldiers, and ambition. Eurydice's husband, weak and pliable, was little more than a vessel through which others ruled. Yet behind his eyes, she saw the reflection of her own fate, to be used, controlled, and displayed. She would not accept it. At first, she moved through court with silence and calculation. In the marble halls of Pella, she watched Cassander's power grow, his charm concealing an ambition more ruthless than any warrior's blade. The house of Dionysius was his creation, but Eurydice knew it served more than pleasure. Within its perfumed walls, alliances were brokered, loyalties tested, and potential threats quietly destroyed. To be invited was honor. To be summoned was peril. One evening, Cassandra's messenger came. The letter bore no seal, only a strand of crimson silk tied around parchment. Eurydice understood its meaning instantly. She had been chosen to grace the feast. The summons was not optional. She entered the hall draped in the ceremonial white of a royal widow, her steps measured and her expression still. The torches burned low, painting the air with gold and smoke. Around her, the generals reclined on couches, the scent of spiced wine mingling with murmured laughter. Cassandra greeted her with a bow that dripped with false respect. "The queen honors the house of the god," he said, and the others echoed him, not out of reverence, but obedience. A musician began to play a lyre, and the gathering resumed its ritual. Eurydice was placed upon a dais near the fountain, where marble figures of nymphs poured water into a basin carved with scenes of conquest. To the crowd, she was a symbol, Macedonia's last surviving royal, the final thread of legitimacy. But to Cassandra, she was something else, the empire's most dangerous relic. He had seen her defy men twice her age, rally soldiers in Philip's name, and challenge the general's decrees. The men feared her intellect more than her lineage. Her presence reminded them of what they had stolen, and of what they could still lose. As the feast grew louder, Cassandra rose and began to speak of unity. He spoke of Alexander's glory, of the divine right of Macedonian blood, and of the gods' favor upon their people. Every word was meant to intoxicate, to stir pride and blind judgment. Then, as the crowd applauded, he turned toward Eurydice and said, "And yet, even among us, there are those who carry Alexander's shadow, a burden they mistake for power." The hall fell silent. Eurydice met his gaze. Her calm was disarming, her silence cutting deeper than any reply. Cassandra smiled thinly and poured wine from a silver jug into her cup. "To the gods," he said, "who know when to end one reign and begin another." She did not drink. That act of refusal, simple and silent, sealed her fate. Within days, her attendants disappeared. Her chambers were moved from the royal palace to the western wing of the house of Dionysius, a gilded prison disguised as honor. Guards whispered that she was there to serve the gods' peace, a phrase that meant nothing and everything. At night, she heard music from the halls, the same laughter, the same hollow joy, while she sat in the dark with only the oil lamp for company. Her reflection in the bronze mirror grew thinner each week. The gold bracelets that once signified royalty now marked her as possession. Yet her mind did not break. If anything, it sharpened. She began memorizing guard patterns, overheard conversations, and the names of those who entered Cassandra's private chambers. Every humiliation she endured was stored like a weapon. One of her maids, a Thracian girl named Athea, whispered that Cassandra had plans, a new performance, one that would symbolize the union of power and obedience. Eurydice understood at once. She was to be part of it. That night, she prayed, not to the gods, but to the memory of Alexander. "You conquered the world," she murmured. "Now lend me the strength to conquer my captor." And so began the slow transformation of a queen into something far more dangerous, a woman who would turn her own captivity into the empire's undoing. The house of Dionysius had grown beyond its walls. What began as a chamber for pleasure had become a shrine of delusion, a place where generals disguised corruption as ceremony, and priests turned cruelty into faith. They claimed to serve the god of ecstasy, but in truth, they worshipped themselves. The rites began at dusk. Torches lined the marble corridors, smoke rising like ghosts. Cassandra's men wore ivy crowns and purple robes, pretending to be followers of Dionysius. the god who blurred the lines between joy and madness. At their side stood the priests, men who once served temples now reduced to flatterers in gold masks. Together, they transformed humiliation into ritual. Each night a new myth was chosen: the union of a god and a mortal, the punishment of a rebel nymph, the fall of a false prophet. Captives were cast in the roles, not to glorify the divine, but to feed the general's decaying vanity. Every gesture, every chant, was rehearsed cruelty. Eurydice was made to stand beside the altar, her wrists bound with silk rather than rope, a mockery of grace. Around her, musicians played slow, fevered tunes while nobles tossed petals and shouted prayers. But beneath the perfume and music, fear hung thick. The participants needed these spectacles. They were no longer warriors or statesmen, only ghosts of an empire pretending to be gods. Cassander watched from his throne, eyes reflecting the torchlight like a serpent's. His obsession with divine power had grown feverish. "We are heirs of Dionysus," he told his council, "and through him, Macedon will never die." His words masked a deeper dread, the knowledge that his empire, stitched together with blood and deceit, was already rotting. Eurydice saw it clearly. Every ritual was a confession, a desperate attempt to prove that they still commanded meaning in a world slipping beyond control. The laughter, the chants, the cruel games, all were shields against the terror of decline. Among the captives was Theon, a young servant who played the flute for the ceremonies. His hands trembled each time the music began, but his eyes were sharp, memorizing every detail: who hesitated, who cheered, who looked away. In silence, he became the first witness to the empire's madness. The rites grew darker as the weeks passed. What began as theater turned into frenzy. The priests declared that true worship required sacrifice, not of animals, but of pride and purity. Cassander agreed. It was no longer enough to pretend to be gods. They would become them through acts that blurred pain, ecstasy. Eurydice was forced to lead the final chant, her voice steady, though her spirit bled. "The god is joy," she said, her words echoing hollowly through the chamber. Behind her, nobles feasted, priests muttered prayers, and captives wept in silence. When the ceremony ended, Cassander approached her. "You understand now," he said softly, "why men need gods they can touch." She looked at him, her eyes calm but cold. "You have not touched a god," she replied. "You have only touched your own decay." That night, the fires in the house of Dionysius burned until dawn. The marble floors were stained with wine and something darker. Yet in the shadows, Eurydice's whisper passed from captive to captive, a quiet vow that this blasphemous temple would one day fall. And somewhere among them, Theon began to write. His first words etched into wax. The rites that claimed to honor gods were nothing more than the empire's confession of guilt. The summer that followed the rites was one of unending banquets. Cassander's court, swollen with victory and vanity, drowned itself in excess. The nobles of Pella, generals, courtiers, and the sons of Alexander's companions gathered nightly in the house of Dionysus. What had once been a sanctuary of ritual was now a theater of decadence, where every appetite demanded spectacle. The banquet hall shimmered with silver lamps. Wine spilled like rivers. Musicians played until their fingers bled. Servants moved like ghosts, unseen, carrying trays of roasted peacock and honeyed figs. Yet beneath the perfume and music, the air reeked of desperation. Each guest sought to forget what the empire had become, a carcass of glory gnawed by its own children. Cassander sat at the center, crowned not as a king but as a god of his own making. His laughter filled the chamber, the sound of a man who mistook cruelty for power. "We are the heirs of Alexander," he declared, raising a cup of red wine. "If the world trembles before us, why should we not feast upon it?" At his command, the night's entertainment began, a grotesque reenactment of divine revelry. The slaves were brought forth, each wearing masks of the gods. One was Apollo, another Artemis, another Dionysius himself. They were ordered to dance, not in joy but in humiliation. The nobles placed wagers on who would stumble, who would weep, who would fall first. Eurydice sat among them, her beauty still luminous despite her captivity. She was forced to watch, her silence mistaken for submission. Yet her gaze was colder than the marble beneath her feet. She saw not dancers but victims, reflections of every city that Macedon had broken, every life consumed by its endless wars. Among the performers was Theon. He wore a mask of Dionysus, his frail frame trembling beneath the heavy garland of ivy. The music rose, wild, dissonant, frantic. The guests shouted for more speed, more frenzy, more blood. Theon's breath quickened. His steps faltered. Still he danced, the flute notes swirling around him like smoke. Then, as the drums thundered, he collapsed, his mask shattering upon the floor. For a moment, there was silence. Then laughter. Cassander lifted his cup and toasted to the god reborn through suffering. The nobles roared approval. Theon lay motionless, his pale hands smeared with spilled wine. Only Eurydice did not move. She rose slowly, her voice cutting through the revelry. "You cheer for death," she said, her words steady, "because you no longer know what life is." Cassander's smile froze. "And what would you know of life, widow?" Eurydice looked at the broken boy before her. "Enough to know that you will drown in your own feasts." Her words lingered like a curse. The hall fell quiet. Even the torches seemed to dim. Cassander said nothing. He merely gestured for the musicians to play again, pretending her voice had not cracked his illusion. But something in the crowd had changed, a flicker of shame, swiftly buried beneath wine and laughter. Later that night, Theon was carried away, barely breathing. Cassander ordered that he be spared, not from mercy, but because the gods do not waste their toys. Theon would live, though his body would never heal. The banquet ended with dawn. The nobles stumbled out, drunk and dazed. Only Eurydice remained in the hall, staring at the empty throne where Cassander had sat. The floor was stained with spilled wine, dark, thick, and glistening like blood. It was then, the narrator says, that pleasure and death became one and the same within Macedon. Theon survived, though survival in the house of Dionysius was no gift. The physicians of the court, eager to please Cassander, saved his life not out of compassion, but convenience. What emerged from their work was not the boy who once played the flute, but something quieter, ghost-like. He could no longer dance nor speak above a whisper. His body bore the marks of the empire's mercy. When he returned to the halls, no one recognized him at first. The guests had already forgotten the boy who collapsed during the feast. They saw only another servant, thin, silent, obedient. Theon moved through the corridors carrying jugs of wine and basins of water, invisible among those who had once jeered at his suffering. But his eyes missed nothing. Eurydice noticed him first. She saw the faint intelligence that lingered behind the veil of submission. When their paths crossed, she whispered, "You remember." Theon nodded. That was all. From that moment, a bond formed between them, not of romance or rebellion, but of shared memory. Cassander's court continued its descent into ritualized madness. The nobles demanded new entertainments, new victims, new proof that their world still held meaning. But Theon, unseen, began to record it all. He found discarded wax tablets in the scribes' quarters and began to carve words by candlelight, slow, deliberate, sacred. He wrote of the banquets, the rites, the laughter that drowned out screams. He recorded names, who gave orders, who looked away, who laughed the loudest. His memory became the empire's unspoken conscience. Each night, after cleaning the halls, he hid the tablets beneath loose stones near the courtyard. Eurydice's defiance deepened. She no longer pretended to serve willingly. During ceremonies, she met the eyes of her captors without fear. The nobles whispered that she had gone mad, that the goddess within her had awoken. Cassander did not punish her. He believed she was still his trophy, the proof of his dominion. Yet even he began to sense that her silence had weight. One evening, as Theon poured wine beside Cassander's throne, the king spoke softly, as if to himself. "A man rules not by fear, but by memory," he said. "If they remember your mercy, they forgive your sins." Theon looked down. His whisper came barely audible. "And if they remember your sins?" Cassander's gaze fixed on him, sharp, cold, curious. "Then they will learn that gods have no need of forgiveness." That night, Theon added another line to his growing chronicle. The god they worship feared only remembrance. Over time, whispers spread among the enslaved, tales of a silent boy who wrote the truth of their suffering. Some said he was blessed by the old gods. Others feared he would bring destruction upon them all. But Eurydice protected him. She arranged that his duties kept him close to her chambers, away from the drunken eyes of the guards. Theon became the quiet heart of the story, a witness, a recorder, a ghost made human again through memory. In his words, cruelty became evidence, not legend. He no longer believed in vengeance. He believed in preservation. For in a world that erased its sins with wine and gold, remembrance itself was rebellion. And so, the house of Dionysius gained an unseen chronicler, a mutilated boy whose fragile whisper carried the weight of the empire's guilt. In those whispers, Eurydice found the first echo of hope. By the time winter arrived in Pella, the house of Dionysius had become both prison and courtroom, a place where the empire measured loyalty by endurance. Eurydice had learned the unspoken rules: never tremble, never plead, never let fear give them dominion over your mind. Yet even her discipline could not soften the gaze of Cassander, whose fascination with her had grown into unease. She had become more than a captive. She was a challenge to the fragile authority he had so carefully constructed. The incident occurred during one of the hall's ceremonies. Captives were arranged in patterns reflecting the myths of Olympus, each playing the part of a mortal caught between divine wills. The nobles laughed, toasting the god whose name they evoked while treating humans as instruments of their delight. Eurydice stood at the center, her eyes surveying the room with a calm that unnerved the generals. When a general attempted to humiliate her, she acted. A gesture, a single deliberate act of contempt, and the court gasped. She spat, not in haste or anger, but with measured defiance. The moment was electric. Silence fell like a blade across the room. Cassander's lips tightened, a flicker of admiration mingled with fury in his eyes. This was no longer amusement. This was insubordination at its purest. The punishment he devised was as cruel as it was symbolic. Eurydice was summoned to the dais and told she must select another captive to bear her suffering, to die in her stead, a choice designed to fracture her spirit. The room held its breath. To comply would signal submission, to refuse would invite death. Eurydice looked across the line of terrified faces, children of conquered lands, women stolen from distant kingdoms, and she said nothing. She refused. Her defiance sent ripples through the house. The captives whispered in hidden corners, sensing a fracture in the carefully maintained hierarchy. The rituals that once bound the palace together now seemed brittle, hollow. The generals, intoxicated by power yet unaccustomed to true resistance, grew uneasy. The spectacle of authority could no longer mask the vulnerability beneath their veneer. Meanwhile, Theon observed everything. His wax tablets, hidden in the shadows, absorbed each detail: the gestures, the words, the subtle shifts in fear and power. He inscribed her refusal not as legend, but as evidence. In his hand, the moment became a record, a single line etched into history, the first crack in the marble. The words carried weight. They marked the beginning of a subtle collapse, a fracture in the structure that had once seemed impregnable. Cassander, for all his rage, could not punish her fully. Her calm intelligence was a mirror to his insecurity. To destroy her would reveal the cracks in his authority. To let her live was to acknowledge her power. So he restrained himself, masking frustration behind feigned ritual and controlled spectacle. That night, Eurydice retreated to the private wing, her eyes scanning the hall she could not yet escape. She understood that her refusal was more than personal resistance. It was symbolic defiance, an assertion that even the most carefully constructed empire was not immune to the will of the powerless. In hushed tones, the slaves began to speak her name with reverence rather than fear. In the shadows, Theon's pen moved swiftly across the wax. "A queen unmoved by fear is the seat of ruin," he wrote. The house of Dionysius, once a theater of control, had become a place of quiet subversion. The first cracks in marble were often invisible, but they always spread, and Eurydice had just begun to let them. The house of Dionysius had grown uneasy. The whispers of defiance, carried in shadowed corridors and beneath the hum of torches, spread faster than Cassander could control. The captives, once cowed by fear, began to notice the cracks, seeing in Eurydice a quiet force that challenged the empire's arrogance. But loyalty is fragile, and in places built on deception and desire, betrayal is never far. Lyca, a courtesan once admired by Cassander for her beauty and obedience, had long served as his informant. She moved among the servants and captives with calculated grace, learning their routines and their secrets. Yet beneath her composed exterior stirred unease, a conscience awakened by the subtle power Eurydice wielded in silence. She began to question her complicity, though the cost of doubt was perilously high. The breaking point came one night when Lyca observed a secret gathering, a small assembly of captives who exchanged words and gestures of rebellion under Eurydice's watchful eye. Fear and admiration intertwined in her mind, yet self-preservation prevailed. The next morning, she revealed their clandestine meetings to the guards, sealing the fate of those who dared resist. Cassander's reaction was swift and merciless. Slaves were seized in the night, their cries echoing through the corridors. Some were executed quietly, their deaths announced only by the absence of bodies at morning rituals. Others were sent to isolation chambers, left to confront despair alone. The house of Dionysius, once a stage of spectacle, had turned inward, consuming its own flesh. The rulers who had once celebrated conquest now wielded terror against those who had served them loyally. Among the punished, a sense of futility spread. The captives, though still alive, sensed the narrowing of hope. Eurydice, confined to her quarters under heavier guard, watched the aftermath with controlled rage. She understood that the empire's cruelty, once directed outward toward conquered lands, now recoiled on its own architects. Cassander's court had become a machine of paranoia and self-destruction. Yet not all betrayal remained absolute. Later, Lyca, overwhelmed by guilt and haunted by the sight of innocents punished, acted secretly. In the dead of night, she approached Theon, her hands shaking as she pressed a small, wrought iron key into his palm. "For the tunnels," she whispered, "you can save them if you dare." Theon accepted it without hesitation. He knew that memory and survival were intertwined, that the empire might destroy bodies, but it could never erase what was remembered. Eurydice's spirit, unbroken despite the punishment, remained their beacon. Through the narrow servant tunnels, plans began to form quietly: escape, subversion, and perhaps vengeance. The house of Dionysius, intended to demonstrate Macedonian might, now revealed its fragility. The very cruelty that had once united Cassander's men against the world was turning inward. Trust had fractured. Fear had replaced loyalty. Ambition and paranoia coiled like serpents through the halls. Even the generals, once so sure of their supremacy, felt it, the subtle tension, the unspoken question of who would betray whom next. That night, as oil lamps flickered across polished marble floors and the distant echoes of punishment carried through the air, Theon etched another note into his wax tablet. The empire devours itself. Every hand that once built its glory now sharpens its own blade. The walls of the house of Dionysius, meant to preserve power and control, were becoming a prison not just for the captives, but for the men who had claimed to be gods. And the first threads of revolt, quiet, measured, inevitable, had begun to weave themselves into the dark tapestry of the palace. Cassander, sensing the faint tremors of unrest, determined to reaffirm his dominion. He planned a final masquerade, a festival of masks, music, and intoxicating spectacle intended to merge fear and revelry, to remind everyone that he alone commanded the house of Dionysius. Nobles and captives alike were summoned, dressed in elaborate costumes, their faces hidden behind painted expressions of gods and heroes. The walls of the hall gleamed with polished bronze, and oil lamps reflected against mirrors to create the illusion of infinite space, of a world entirely under Cassander's control. Eurydice, standing among the disguised captives, observed the preparations quietly. Every guard posted along the corridors, every torch carefully lit, and every noble's overconfident posture was noted. Beside her, Theon moved silently, carrying his wax tablets concealed beneath a cloth. The boy who had once collapsed mid-dance now held in his hand the memory of years of cruelty, a record of injustice that could outlive them all. Tonight, it would be put to use. The mask began as intended, music rose in frenzied waves, laughter mingled with whispered prayers, and wine flowed in abundance. The nobles danced, their eyes gleaming with the thrill of dominion. Servants moved like shadows, placing goblets and guiding dancers. Every act was a display of power, until the hidden plan of Eurydice and Theon was set in motion. Behind the walls, oil lamps were ignited in carefully concealed niches. A faint, smoky smell began to drift into the hall, unnoticed by the intoxicated guests. The flames crept slowly, climbing the wooden beams and silk drapes, feeding on layers of fabric and oil-soaked tapestries. The illusion of control remained, even as chaos silently gathered strength. Eurydice moved with deliberate calm. She whispered instructions to Theon, who passed from shadow to shadow, guiding terrified captives toward hidden exits and safe alcoves. The nobles continued to toast one another, oblivious to the first tongues of fire curling along the draperies above their heads. The hall seemed endless, a stage set for both ceremony and disaster. Then the flames leapt. Silk curtains caught fire with a sudden crackle. Smoke rolled across the marble floors. Screams erupted, shattering the music and laughter. Nobles stumbled blindly, clutching goblets, their masks skewed, as the illusion of mastery burned away. Captives scrambled for hidden tunnels, some guided by Theon, others by sheer instinct. Cassander tried to command order, but his voice was swallowed by panic. The pillars, blackened and weakened by hidden oil, began to collapse with dull, resounding crashes. The once gilded hall of pleasure transformed into a labyrinth of fire and terror. The smell of burning wine and charred fabric mingled with the suffocating heat, marking the hall as a place where revelry had become ruin. In the chaos, Eurydice moved toward Cassander, unbroken, her eyes meeting his in silent accusation. The throne he had once occupied like a god now trembled under the flames, and for the first time, Cassander's power felt fragile. Around them, the house of Dionysius, the emblem of Macedonian indulgence and cruelty, was collapsing, a mirror to the empire's decay. As the first walls gave way, Theon led the surviving captives through the tunnels. The fire consumed the masks, the torches, and the pomp, leaving only the raw memory of defiance and destruction. Eurydice remained within the hall, a living witness to the ruin she had helped orchestrate, standing in the eye of a storm she had ignited. The fire raged through the house of Dionysius with a ferocity no one had anticipated. Flames hungrily consumed the gilded walls, torch sconces and silk draperies. Smoke thickened into a choking veil that turned the hall into a tomb of shadows. Screams echoed from corridors and tunnels alike, some rising from panic, others from captives trapped in the grasp of collapsing ceilings. The Empire's proudest display of indulgence was now reduced to ash and ruin. Theon led a small group of survivors through hidden passages beneath the hall. Each step was measured, silent, as the heat pressed against their backs and the smell of burning wood and spiced wine filled their lungs. Among them were women and children, their eyes wide with terror, their trust placed entirely in the boy who had witnessed years of cruelty. Every moment of survival had been learned, memorized, and recorded. Tonight, those lessons would be tested in reality. Above them, Eurydice moved toward the burning throne, where Cassander remained trapped by his own arrogance. He called out, demanding obedience, yet his words carried no power. The flames licked the marble steps, curling around his throne as if mocking his former dominance. Eurydice's eyes, cold and unwavering, met his. She did not speak. She did not flinch. The empire that had imprisoned her, humiliated her, and tested her spirit was crumbling, and she was the witness to its final reckoning. Cassander lunged, attempting to seize her as the beams overhead groaned under heat and strain. But the structure betrayed him. Columns cracked and ceilings collapsed, forcing him to retreat. Eurydice stood firm, the fire surrounding them like a ring of judgment. Every step she took was deliberate, a statement of defiance against the cruelty that had defined Macedon for decades. In the tunnels, Theon guided the survivors to the river outside the city walls. His hands were blackened with soot, his throat raw from smoke, yet his mind remained alert, recording each detail silently on hidden wax tablets. The chronicles of suffering, endurance, and resistance would survive even if every stone above them turned to ash. Back in the hall, the collapse became inevitable. Walls buckled, ceilings gave way, and the final gilded throne tumbled into the inferno. Eurydice, surrounded by fire, faced Cassander one last time. The noble who had ruled through fear and desire now trembled at the magnitude of his own destruction. She did not raise her voice, did not plead, did not fight. She simply let the flames witness the Empire's failure, a punishment far greater than death. When the last supports collapsed, Eurydice vanished beneath the debris. The fire consumed everything she had once been forced to endure, the symbols of cruelty, the stage of corruption, the halls where human dignity had been twisted into spectacle. Cassander, buried beneath the ruins, would be remembered only as a cautionary shadow, a man undone by his own hubris. Theon emerged into the cold night, carrying the surviving captives and the only record of the house's horrors, the wax tablets. Smoke trailed across the river, carrying the scent of charred ambition and vanished lives. The house of Dionysius was no more, but memory remained. And in that silence, the Empire's sins had been witnessed, recorded, and survived. By the first light of dawn, Pella was unrecognizable. Smoke clung to the air like a shroud, curling over the shattered marble of streets and palaces. The city that had once gleamed with gold and ambition now lay muted. A city scarred not by foreign conquest, but by the sins of its own rulers. The house of Dionysius, the symbol of Macedonian indulgence and cruelty, had become a ruin, charred beams and crumbled walls, the only testament to the horrors that had taken place within. Cassander's power had dissolved with the flames. His name, once spoken with reverence, was now cursed among his own men. Soldiers whispered his failures, nobles recounted his obsession with control, and the few who survived the fire shunned his memory. The empire he had hoped to preserve through terror and spectacle had been poisoned by the very acts that were meant to secure it. Among the smoke and rubble, Theon moved quietly. He carried nothing but his wax tablets, the sole record of what had occurred within the house. Every detail of suffering, defiance, and cruelty was etched into the fragile wax, a testament to endurance and remembrance. He did not linger. The city was no longer a place of safety, nor of empire. He vanished into obscurity, leaving behind the ashes of both palace and power, but taking with him the memory of Eurydice and the courage she had inspired. Eurydice's fate remained uncertain to those who emerged into the ruined streets. Some whispered that she had perished beneath the collapsing roof. Others believed she had escaped through the hidden passages known only to a few. Yet among the slaves, her name carried weight. She became more than a queen, more than a captive. She was a symbol of resistance. Whispers of her defiance spread quietly, traveling from household to household, a memory unbroken by fire or fear. The survivors of the house of Dionysius carried both relief and trauma. They had witnessed power collapse, cruelty turn inward, and death mingle with the rituals of pleasure. But within that horror, seeds of understanding had been planted. Even in the darkest halls of tyranny, memory and courage could endure. The empire, though vast and ambitious, had proven itself fragile, a construct vulnerable to the actions of those it sought to dominate. As the sun climbed, casting pale light over blackened marble, Pella remained silent. The once lavish city bore the scars of its ruler's decadence, a reminder that indulgence and cruelty leave wounds deeper than any sword. And in that silence, the lessons of the house of Dionysius lingered, a warning to those who sought to rule through fear, and a testament to those who endured it. Theon disappeared into the expanse of Macedonia, carrying with him both the story and the burden of remembrance. Eurydice's memory, preserved in whispers and wax, survived beyond her captivity, beyond the fire, and beyond the empire itself. The house of Dionysius was gone, but its tale, recorded in suffering and defiance, endured as a haunting shadow over Pella and over history itself. In that same generation, the brothel was destroyed, the empire poisoned by its own sins, and the last survivors haunted by what they had endured, a final, silent testament to the cost of power corrupted and courage unbroken.